Hey there, theology nerds. This is Ryan Miller, elder of Denver Hopalicious Goodness, hashtag Denver Pub Theology. And you are listening to another edition of Homebrew Christianity. Share the brew.
Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and you are listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we bring you audiological ingredients for you to brew your own zesty, tasty faith. I don't want to think for you, but with you. And today on the podcast, you're going to hear the one and the only Callid Keith Perry talking to Jennifer Grace Bird about her brand new book, Permission Granted. Take the Bible into your own hands. Jennifer Grace Bird teaches at University of Portland, which I believe is in the city of Portland, Oregon. Yes. And she's a Bible scholar, and now she is not writing the giant footnoted thing that requires large amounts of patience and slow reading. She wrote this book for, the larger audience, and you're going to get to hear her talk about it. So, Callid, thanks for talking to her. Jennifer, this is an amazing interview. I'm very excited for you all to hear it. Before we jump in to the interview, I just want to tell Ryan, who you heard right at the front, elder of that pub theology excitement in Denver. Hi. He joined the Homebrewed Christianity community. That's the over 60 people who signed up, and every month they make a donation to keep this podcast you're listening to coming to you for free, and they get little perks and stuff. Like, I just mailed out a stack of deacon cards, like theology nerd ID cards. And the first time you get to hang out with me and you have the ID card on, you flash it, I buy you a drink, maybe, coffee in the morning, a beer at night, whatever it is, and then you pick any topic, and you're going to take my phone, and I'm going to rant about said topic. I do request it not be the superiority of the Spurs to the Lakers. Someone did that to me already. I'm not sure I could put that rant on the podcast. But for the rest of you, assuming it's something that's not so painful, it would get on there. Anyway, if you're a deacon and you're going to be at the General Assembly for the Disciples of Christ this July in Columbus, Ohio, then maybe it can happen there. But let me know you're going to be there, because we have a podcast, a live podcast there with Sharon Watkins and plenty of other excitement, music, fun, and that podcast is already sold out. So if you didn't get your ticket, I'm sorry, but you should let me know. That way we can at least hang out while we're there in town for the General Assembly of the Disciples of Christ. So we're going to jump in to this interview, and I hope you have a great time. But just know, no Los Angelites, that there's a couple live podcasts we'll be announcing soon. Ones that are going to make you pretty excited. I just can't tell you today. They're coming soon. There's also going to be the most epic theology conference in March in Los Angeles, very beginning of March. And if I told you who's going to be there, you would do a geekalicious nerdy dance. But I can't tell you yet. But I'm going to tell you soon that too. Also, I just finished writing all the rest of the book I'm working on, Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, Liar, Lunatic, Lord, or Just Freaking Awesome. That's the first book in the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to series with Fortress Press, and I'm pretty pumped about it. I have no idea if it's amazing or the world's greatest book of all time. I don't know. But I enjoyed writing it, and I'm really excited for you all, especially listeners, to get it and read it and tell me what you think. Because, honestly, who would have ever wanted me to write a book unless they found out that people like you listen to this, and they're like, there must be an audience for this rather snarky, super nerdy, religious-y type thing. Yeah, and maybe there is, but we're going to find out. Anyway, I just finished that. That's exciting. And it is going to be released at the American Academy of Religion in Atlanta this November. And I'm going to be doing that live podcast at the American Academy of Religion in Atlanta And guess who the special featured guest is going to be? Nope, that's not it. I'm going to let you guess one more time. Think even more awesome. Think German. Think most important Christology in the 20th century. You're right. It is Jürgen Moltmann. That's right. Jürgen Moltmann is going to be on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast in Atlanta at the American Academy of Religion for the 40th anniversary of the Crucified God. And my book. One is life-changing, and the other one, my mom will like better. Anyway, we're going to jump into the podcast. Jennifer Grace Bird talking Permission Granted with Callid Keith Perry on Homebrewed Christianity. And just buckle your theological safety belt because, you should think about taking the Bible into your own hands if you haven't done it recently. All right? Go to the Homebrewed Christianity website, holler back, share the brew, and stay super zesty.
So, folks, this is a great opportunity today. I have on the line here Jennifer Grace Bird, who is the author of Permission Granted, Take the Bible into Your Own Hands. Jennifer is an adjunct faculty at the University of Portland and Portland Community College. She's also a traveling speaker and teacher. She's available for your congregations and denominations to get their hands dirty in this amazingly good book. The text, again, is Permission Granted, and what I'll start with, Jennifer, is what do people need permission for in terms of the Bible? Why is that the title here?
All right, thank you. That's a great entree. The title comes from, actually a friend suggested it to me, but it comes from talking about what happened in my intro courses. So I taught a couple dozen intro courses to both testaments of the Bible. And what I would always find, especially at the beginning of the semester, when I'm telling students, I'm not going to tell you what you should think. Yeah. And actually, I want to hear your questions. Your questions are not off limits. They are welcome. And I would literally just kind of watch people the tension, anxiety, something just roll off of them. And it was as if they had needed someone to tell them it's okay to think. So we do that in all other parts of our world, but in our lives. But it seems that in the realm of faith, people often need someone to say that it's okay, because so many of them grew up, and it tended to be women, but not always. But I've had lots of students over the years tell me that they were told that their questions were inappropriate. They were told that line of thinking was not acceptable or welcome, and so they were silenced, or just they chose to stop coming, or stop attending church or whatever. So for those who need it, for those who want someone to say, really, it's okay to think for yourself. That's what the title's about.
Now, this is interesting because from my perspective, I can see absolutely how it would be the case that that's who the book is for. But I also think, and I'm curious, and in the end, especially the last little short chapter that closes it out, it felt to me like you were gesturing there again. But it's also for the people who think that people who read the Bible seriously are crazy to read and say, look, do you understand how this all fits together and your faith and their faith are together? So I read it also, not just as for folks who've been told to not question the Bible, but also for people who have no idea how to handle their brothers and sisters and cousins and or brothers and sisters in the church who understand the Bible that way. Does that read work for you?
God, I love that was your reading. Yeah, that does work for me. Absolutely. Yeah. And it seems maybe impossible that those are both happening in the same book, but that was right. But I love that you saw it because, yes, I think that this book is helpful no matter where you are in terms of your relationship to the Bible or to the church, right? I've had lots of friends and people in churches who were essentially saying what you just said. They're a bit more progressive and they have a lot of really conservative family members, and they don't know how to have a conversation with their family members. And they went and picked up this book and started reading it, and they thought, oh, well, this helped me to reframe the way I think about my family's connection to this situation, to the Bible or whatever. I've had lots of atheist students who loved this content, right? Because it was either freeing for them, helpful for them to reframe the whole conversation. However you want to look at that. So Yes, I wrote with kind of a conservative person in mind, and I dialogued with myself as a 20-year-old, kind of more conservative, literalist kind of a reader. But I do think it does give something useful to kind of a whole spectrum of people. Yeah.
And actually, quite literally in the text, you're often talking. I mean, I stopped counting, but the number of times where you said, well, I myself used to, and I used to, and I mean, it's over and over, which is to say, kind of you're speaking from a particular perspective. And actually, I wonder if before we get into some more of the kind of the biblical comment and commentary, if you would be willing to kind of share the story that you share in the introduction regarding you and your mother, and the kind of the twisted way that got woven together in a backwards way from what a lot of other people might understand. I think that's a kind of important launching pad for the work that you do here.
Great. Thank you. Sure. So I grew up in a family that attended a Methodist church. So, kind of mainstream in terms of the commitment, I guess. It's not a big Bible touting kind of a congregation, I should say. So in my teenage years, I kind of took my own swing as I talk about it, however you want to put the language onto that. But I went into a much more conservative kind of community. It's specifically with Young Life, but that was my specific community of folks. And I went from growing up in a church that had women as pastors to believing that having women as pastors was wrong because of what the Bible says, and of course, in my teenage years, didn't think through that, very much. It was just a part of the picture, right? I had women who were important to me, who were ordained, and now I'm saying I think that's wrong. I did, lots of personal choices that I made because of the way I was reading the Bible in a fairly literalistic. I'd say that because it's usually actually much more complicated than that. I started changing the way I dressed so that I wouldn't cause men to stumble. All kinds of crazy things that my family just looked at me and said, what's Jen doing here? But I think you referenced the specific thing with my mother, and that is that in my 20s, my mother was ordained in the Methodist Church, and I attended that ceremony and was even quite moved by it, even though I was not comfortable with it, really, ultimately. And on the car ride home after that amazing and powerful day for my mother, for some reason, it was just me and my mom in the car ride home for 5 hours. And I just looked at her and said, Mom, I don't know how you could do this, be ordained, because it's against God's will. And when I usually tell this story, I say, to her good credit, she did not push me out of the moving van. But what she did do was tell me her story. And you can't argue with someone's story, you just have to listen to it. And that's what I did. I listened. I was speechless, probably for the first time in my life. I didn't know what to do with it, and I just sat with it because I still believed what I believed because of the Bible, but I'm listening to Mom tell me her story, which was other people looked at her and said, Marianne, you're talented, you're gifted. And, she just kind of honored that. And so, that in a sense is a big turning point, was a big turning point for me. Yes. But, kind of a couple other layers similar to that. Women who were important to me were saying things to me that they were seeing me do because of the way I was reading scripture, that the things I was doing were harmful to me, actually, harmful to myself. And I wasn't actually fully being who I am because of the way I read scripture. Is that making sense? Yeah.
And I know you're not a sociologist or a psychologist, but I do think it's an interesting thing to note. And I think we're seeing it more now maybe than we have before, is that at the same time we're seeing people sometimes in a more conservative Christian tradition kind of leaving the tradition and or leaving the church, but we're also seeing young folks, men and women, teenagers who are kind of moving right. And I'm wondering, for you, do you know what was that the heart of that, or is there? I mean, before we kind of get into some of the black and white of the book itself, I mean,
sure.
What happens when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, what was the appeal for me is partly what I think you're asking. And I think it was that there was enthusiasm and excitement, especially given the particular, organization I was kind of drawn to. But there was also a lot of definitive answers. And at this point in my life, I don't think of life as being full of definitive answers, But at that point, it was nice. It was helpful. Someone said, there's a formula that you're sinful, accept, and it's good, and now go live it. And it kind of was black and white a little more, right? It was clear. It's nice to have answers, Callid. I mean, life is tough. And anyway, so I think that was it for me, that having the energy, the excitement, and the definitive outlines of what to do and what not to do. I mean, it kind of, I think, was that simple. And I think that is a draw for a lot of people. Don't tell, it's easier if someone just tells you what to think or how to behave, as opposed to having to actually sort it through for yourself,
Yeah.
Morally.
And it's interesting
because there's ways in which the kind of biblical scholarship has its own kind of cycles and rhythms, but there is some tendency on one side to kind of, via like Boltmann's world, kind of do the demythologization thing, where whether people are understanding that or not, they're ending up with this text, which is relatively just like a collection of data points, right? There's not a lot of energy or oomph in there, and I think that's partly a misappropriation of Boltmann. But there's people who are people of faith, specifically progressive folks, who kind of treat the Bible, just like a collection of stories, and there's not a lot of vim and verve left in it because of critical historical stuff.
Right.
But on the other side, there's literalism, and I think neither one of them seems to have a whole lot of staying power generationally. And it seems to me like what you're attempting to do here, and I'd be curious to hear your response about my kind of thought on this, is to say, look, we can be critical about it, but we can't just treat the text like a series of data points or even just stories. We have to kind of understand it's part of our story, and that we're supposed to be caught up in it, but let's not be caught up in it in a way that it's either literalist and or just factual. You're trying to kind of carve out a middle space in there. Does that work for you, or am I overreading, or how do you think about that?
Really, the main thing from my perspective about this book is that I am interested in having people know what's in there. The excitement and the verve, all of that life, I think people will bring to whatever they end up doing, however they end up reading. They'll find a way to do that. From my perspective, I just want people to know when they hear someone say, I believe the Bible, I want them to have a certain set of things run through their mind saying, really? You really believe the Bible? Are you aware that X, Y, and Z is actually in there? Right. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, at least my initial intention. I'm not trying to, bridge any sort of emotional or progression versus conservative readings. I just want people to know what's in there.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things I think is interesting. It's like there's so many books about the Bible, but one of the things that is really, and again, I'm not a Bible scholar, I'm a theologian, but I think that what struck me in here is that most of the time, and I'm trying to even think of any example that isn't this, when a question comes up where it's like, well, do you really think that, you don't turn to a secondary scholar, you say, just go read the passage. Like, it's not, look at N.T. Wright says this, or Brueggemann says this. It's like, the Bible says this.
Right. That's where you need to go, because you're smart enough at this point in your life, right? And then you can go see if you agree with what N.T. Wright says, or whoever you tend to trust. Right. Yeah. Instead of just, yeah.
And it's interesting because for example, I'm thinking about, I can't find it now, but I think it's the garden chapter where you turn people into what the text says. Then you say, now, for example, let's look and see how it was read before. And then you go through what Tertullian and Origen and who else would have been in there? Probably Augustine. You go through the list and you say, but then you're still saying, but you just read it yourself. So,
right.
So you tell me what you think about these church fathers.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's just it. And what's so interesting is we are, at least within the Christian community, significantly influenced by what those three guys said, and a little bit of what Paul did in the Newer Testament. But most people are just clueless about the fact that they are much more influenced by someone else's reading into that story than what is actually in the story. And it's amazing how many times I've walked through the story with people, and they, we look at it all together as a class, or however we do that, and they still come out saying, what they thought before. And I get that. It's a hard thing to see and change the way you think about something so formative and central, really. Yeah. That's that story.
And I don't hear you in here trying to say you can kind of get, I have friends who are in the Christian church, no book but the Bible, no creed but Christ, where
Okay.
I don't hear you saying, well, if you just read it hard enough, then you'll really get it. You don't deny that no matter what, those theological glosses or lenses are going to be acting on us. You just want to name them and say that they are acting on us.
Yes, precisely. And I don't, that's an interesting thing, the phrasing you just used in terms of if you just read it hard enough, you'll get it. And I think
that's
you're
being very technical, by the way.
No, I get Well, but also it's like, there are so many different conversations in the air here, right? Because some people are not really happy with what I'm trying to say, which is, at the end of the day, I hope you don't like some of the pieces that are in there. I don't want you to just get on board with everything and find a way to make it all make sense. I don't want that, because I find that some of it's really actually harmful. And so, the idea, if you just work on it hard enough, it'll make sense. You'll find a way. No, my thing is, if you just sit with it and just be honest about it, what's there, honest with yourself, honest with what you've been told, and sit with it. What do you actually really think? Yeah.
So now I think, it makes sense to kind of talk about what we're doing in this book. So you open with this chapter, what the Bible is and what the Bible is not. And then you pick, let's see here, 10, is that probably true? Yeah. 10 topics that often come up regarding people talk about X in the Bible. And I just wanted, Deacons, I want you to hear these things. So the 10 kind of things that get addressed in here are the 2 creation stories, what goes on in the garden, sex, violence, editing in the Bible, biblical women, virgin birth, Jesus, as if Jesus is one thing, was Paul the first Christian, and then the apocalypse. So each of those topics are covered chapter by chapter. And what Jennifer does is she addresses some common articulations about, for example, the creation story. And then she says, well, let's take a look at the text. And none of this is going to be particularly kind of world-shattering for you if you're already doing critical or progressive biblical studies. But what the text does, at least my take on it, is that it sets these up in such a way that you could read a chapter in, 15 minutes, and then it comes with questions at the end, and you can have a conversation that may be challenging depending on who's in the room with you, but is likely to be fruitful. Can you talk a little bit about, I'll just take, for example, the creation story, because that's a useful one.
Sure.
What's the way that people often talk about the creation story, and then what's your take on it in here, just to give people a flavor for kind of how these chapters go through and get walked out?
Sure, great. So the general overview of what I usually hear people, what I used to think, and therefore what I end up running into, is that people think that there's just one creation story, that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are just one creation story. And then for some people who have sat with it a little bit and see that there's 2 different versions going on, sometimes people will say, that first chapter, the day by day, and, God said, and it was good, and it was good. That some people say that was almost like a Platonic kind of a rendering. That was the forms, and then, or the spiritual realm. And then the second version is God creating the bodily and the physical realm, which is an interesting rendering, way to handle the 2 different stories. But within the book, what I try to help people see is that these are 2 separate stories coming from 2 different, traditions, as we might think of them, 2 different groups of people, maybe priestly and maybe just good storytellers, or however you want to think of it, so that you look through chapter 1 for yourself and you think about what's being said there, and you see that God is addressed in a particular way, and you see a particular style of writing, and you see a particular end note, which is, what is this story trying to say? When you get to the end of the story and you have the therefore, you have a something, it sums it all up. We have these 6 days of creation, and God rested on the 7th. And there's a moment here where we're looking at it and seeing this story is trying to tell us something in and of itself, and let it do that. Right. So I do have a chart, as I think I'm not sure if you referenced that, but there's a chart for you to kind of work through that. Like there are things going on in chapter 1 that are specific, and then look at chapter 2 and look at the way God is addressed and the kind of language, in chapter 1, you have God kind of, I like to think of God as, if you had it on a stage, God would be off stage with a microphone, speaking things into being, off stage. Whereas in chapter 2, God is right there in the midst of things, literally getting his hands dirty, to create the first human. And so working through those two separately on their own and looking at the language really actually shows that there's much more to it than just one creation story. It's much more rich. It's much more full. But for those who've always thought of it as just one, this is a really startling realization. At least it was for me, Yeah.
And it's interesting because, especially in regards to that chart, you've made a decision in this book to kind of not create a text at the end of which someone could be like, yeah, I really agree with Jennifer Bird, because you're not really arguing a whole lot for a particular biblical scholastical point or a certain gloss on this or the Q text or you're just not doing that work. It seems to me that the thrust of the text is it's a platform for dialogue.
Yes.
And so, for example, what you've had to do is, so what is it? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 10 questions and then some scripture verses. It says, go figure out what the answers to these questions are based on the Genesis 1 account and the Genesis 2 account. And right. I like that because you could easily have just done it yourself.
Right.
It told us what the difference is between the Genesis 1 and 2.
Exactly.
And I wouldn't have had to open my Bible.
Exactly. I actually, he might be really upset at me for saying this, but my father is, an well-educated man, but he started reading the book. He's like, oh, I've got to have a Bible nearby to read this book. And I was like, that's actually the point. Yes, it is. Thank you, Callid. That's precisely what I'm trying to do.
Well, I had to go, as a theologian, I wasn't sure where my Bible was, so I had to go find it first. And then remember how the order of things goes. So at least the first one was easy. I knew it was at the beginning.
Right.
So that's terrific. And so, I guess I would be interested in you talking about the decision to make the book that way. So, you have another text that's out, which is not that. It's you as a scholar doing the scholarly task. And so somewhere along the line, it must have been a decision somehow to say, you know what, with this text, I'm not going to do that work. It's not as if there's not research involved in here. Clearly there is, because you got to figure out what questions to ask, where the controversy is pointed, when do you talk about Tertullian and Origen, but after citing the text itself, back and forth. So can you talk to us a little bit about that decision?
Sure. The first book, just to be clear, is my dissertation, right? My dissertation, which I was grateful to have a place to have that published. Just to say, I'm really proud of that work, and I never grew tired of it. It is a book that I'm delighted is, being read at Harvard and Yale divinity schools. Like I do think it's actually important scholarship as well. But at the end of the day, Callid, I want to make a bigger difference than just at the higher level. I sat in these classes. I sat in them as a student, and I taught so many of them that so many times people said, I wish someone had told me this sooner. I wish I knew X, Y, or Z sooner. Why am I just finding out that the Samson story is so much more complex than what I was taught as a child? That's just as a reference, that's in the edited chapter where I talk about a lot of the stories that we teach children, or in particular, and we teach them an edited version, not the full version. So my decision to go with this particular book in a much more user-friendly, person in the pew kind of a mentality or mindset was just that. There's so much easily accessible things about the Bible for people to know. They don't have to go be in a classroom. This kind of a book, it just seemed to me, was really important. And I feel, and I hope that it actually makes a difference for people. That's the thing. I think, high-minded scholarship is good and important, and it has a place. But I wanted to help other people that aren't able to be in the classroom. So,
can you think? I think it's a kind of interesting way to move about this work, which is to say, what's the relationship between your own kind of top-level professional, high-minded scholarship and a text like this? Do you think that work for you was necessary to do this writing? This is kind of an elegance to to simplifying sometimes. I'm wondering if you thought about that. Yeah.
I have thought a lot about it. Actually, you and I could probably have a very long conversation about that some other time. It's a frustration, actually. But
what's the frustrating part, Jennifer?
The frustrating part is that what it takes to get a university position is a lot of really important hard work, research, and scholarship. And I love that and get that. But what that often means is that people in those positions are not in touch with essentially reality. They're not in touch with 99% of the population. And they don't know how to talk to. They don't know how to, what you just said, it's kind of an elegance to make these ideas relevant. It's hard work. It comes out of a lot of conversations. My first semester out of PhD work, I was a very different teacher than I was 6 years in. And I think I was a much better teacher 6 years in, but I had worked through trying to bring all of those important theoretical ideas into a regular conversation, trying to help really leading people into a conversation. Or as my teaching philosophy says, I think of teaching and education as an invitation to understanding each other, to listening, having a conversation. And that's hard. That is hard work. So my own career trajectory has been not at all what I would have anticipated. I don't have a tenure. There was downsizing involved, and that's why I'm no longer at the school where I taught for 6 years, Greensboro College. And so I did have a fairly secure situation there, and I don't now. And I look at all my colleagues who've done a lot of work, and I look at people in positions at places like Harvard and Yale and Drew and all these great institutions. And I think about the disconnect. I guess that's kind of part of what you were getting at. I think a lot about this. What is the purpose of scholarship? And as you hinted at the beginning of this question, I couldn't have written this particular book without having done all of the research that went into my dissertation and subsequent years, right? I mean, it is necessary. That scholarship, that level of inquiry and conversation and struggle intellectually and faith-wise is necessary to get to this. And it's interesting that the scholars who've chosen to try to do what this is referred to as kind of popular, that sounds kind of a negative term, but the scholars who've chosen to do popular work are not thought of, it's kind of a slight on them. They try to make academic ideas accessible. Is seen is not a good thing. I find that fascinating, don't you? I mean, I thought that's what we're supposed to do, is try to make these ideas, right? Are we supposed to try to help people?
I often talk to my colleagues about whether or not help and or spiritual formation is and or ought to be on anybody's syllabus. And I think most of the time it's not there. That's not actually what they're for explicitly. So the document, which serves as a contract between a faculty person and their students, says all the things that the class is supposed to be for, and very, very rarely is it supposed to be useful or supposed to be about their spiritual growth and health. And I say that as a joke, but I think it matters that if you flip open the syllabus of, I don't know, almost anywhere, you're not going to find utility as one of the bullet points of the takeaways. Now, this could just be kind of because of some language games, because of seminary or not, but I want to go a little bit and say, well, why not? Why isn't one of the purposes of the course supposed to be you understanding the usefulness of a post-colonial critique on X? Instead, it's just, do you know about why it is? Do you know how to do it? You understand what the literature, you understand what the body is. A lot of it isn't actually transformative action or internal kind of emotional, empathetic, or even relational commentary. We still function primarily in a kind of content knowledge, which is, as you said, wildly important. But it's interesting because the book, Permission Granted, is written where the emphasis isn't on content knowledge, it's on relational knowledge. The book is set up to have you interact with other people. And most of the other time, the books are set up for you to interact with your idea of the author only.
Yes.
And so for me, this is one of the reasons I wanted to kind of have you on the show, is I think that you've made a very clear attempt to say this book is for you to be with other people with. This is not a book for you to be alone with me with. Not that you're not lovely and people shouldn't spend time with you.
Right.
But the purpose of the text is clearly to push people back out into their communities.
Lovely. I'm just delighted to hear you say that. And part of that comes out of the fact that, even in a classroom, it takes working out together, right? I put ideas out there, I throw suggestions out there for people to think about, but it's when the students themselves engage the ideas and listen to each other and go back and forth that they are actually able to be transformed or changed in their thinking. And so that's precisely why I've tried to bring that kind of an experience into a text, into a book. Yes.
So I want to go through another one of kind of your kind of topic areas, just to kind of give people another kind of little appetizer here.
Sure.
And I thought that the one that would be kind of interesting to do, because it's so popular all over the place, this conversation, is your chapter, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up? And I think it's really interesting because the cultural kind of the mimetic thing you're addressing is, I love Jesus. Do you love Jesus? Has Jesus saved you? Right? Where Jesus is a kind of a marker for something which isn't necessarily biblical. Maybe it is sometimes, or maybe parts of it are, or parts of it are not. But the way Jesus functions in, do you love Jesus, or do you know Jesus, or are you dating Jesus, or is there Jesus in your heart, or any of these popular uses of the word Jesus kind of are stand-in for a whole series of worldviews and thoughts, which may or may not actually be biblical. And so then you say, let's talk a little bit about another way to understand Jesus. And how does that sound, Jennifer?
Oh, lovely. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great setup and for what's going on in this chapter. Absolutely. How many people actually, how many people who say, I love Jesus, actually stop to think about what that means? Like, what do they think is on the other side of that? What are they signifying? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I say that as a person who hadn't, as a person who in my teens and 20s said that. I love Jesus. But I never really stopped to think about, where did that construction of Jesus come from for me? And is that entirely biblical? I hadn't thought that through, Yeah. Yeah. And what you see when you go and, again, read it for yourself, right? Not just what you've had your pastor tell you. It's amazing how quite different what we have done over the years with the idea of Jesus. I just like the way you phrased it. I feel like I don't need to follow up. Like, you put it so nicely. What we've been taught over the years to kind of a generalization or a general idea of what Jesus is, pulled from various texts that you like, that resonate with you from the various Gospels.
So what happens when people read the text themselves? I mean, what's the vision of Jesus that is in the Bible then?
Well, I think there are actually 4 different Jesuses, which is why the playful title. But not that they are all entirely mutually exclusive, but that when we talk about there being a Jesus, if you will, for a moment, what we're missing is that the 4 gospel writers were trying to do something. They were each trying to highlight a particular element of who Jesus was, and that element of Jesus was important at that point in time, in that part of the Jesus movement, if you will, in the first century, and for a particular audience. I hear people say that they get that each writer was writing for a particular audience, but I'm not sure how many people sit with that and think through what that actually means. That the portrayal of Jesus in Matthew is that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, which just flies in the face of what Jews up until that point had been expecting and looking for as a Messiah. So Matthew's got to build a case. Matthew builds a case for Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And that needs to sit on its own, I think. I think you need to let that be what it is and then read Mark for what Mark is doing. And Mark is doing something very different and earlier and much shorter, and the first version, the first round, if you will, of the Gospels. The Gospel of John, I mean, I struggle with how to talk about the Gospel of John because I want to respect the fact that it tends to be the most popular for people today, especially within the more evangelical or charismatic and conservative communities. And I want to respect that. But that in and of itself, for me, gets back to one of your earlier questions, which is, why was I drawn to a more conservative realm? Well, part of it is the Jesus in John is very definitive. he walks around saying, I am this, I am that, this is the way, the truth, and life. This is how you get to heaven, is to believe in me, and that's all you need to do. And that believe in Jesus, have the right belief system, is very different than what we see, say, in Luke. Luke's Jesus is talking about this world, right? Addressing this world's problems, and that is where salvation is. Just the fact that there are two different ideas of salvation, even in just two of the Gospels, much less, all the letters from Paul. That was something I didn't know in my 20s. I had to, kind of blew my mind and made me uncomfortable. What do you mean there's more than one idea of salvation coming from Jesus's lips? Like that was radical to me. So I think, having a chance to sit with these things and just think through them. What does that mean? That though you may prefer the John, that's fine, the Jesus and John, that's great. It's good for you to be aware that there's another depiction or two of Jesus than just the one in John.
So I'm going to kind of play the devil's advocate here and say, okay, so let's say I know the things that you're talking about. I'm familiar with that. But it sounds to me an awful lot like you're suggesting that the gospel writers have ulterior motives that are more important than them talking about Jesus. That you think the gospel writers are trying to manipulate the story of Jesus. Is that what you're saying?
It's in part what I'm saying, but I don't intend there to be a negative slant to that. And I think part of the response to your question, it's a really important question and a really important challenge to what I've just said, is that this ties into the first chapter of the book, the idea of how we're taught to think about what the Bible is and is not. Right. And so by the time we get to the Gospels, many people read the Gospels or think about the Gospels as being biographies and as being stories that depict what happened, and that they're kind of historical and they tell us the truth. They tell us, this, and this, and we think of them as being similar to biographies today. And they're not. I don't think ancient biographies were doing things as we do them today. They weren't necessarily trying to be chronological. They weren't necessarily trying to tell all of the stories. They were telling the stories that pointed to the essence of the person that they had in mind for you to understand. So, when you say, are you, Dr. Bird, suggesting that, the gospel writers had an agenda? I am, but I don't think it was malicious. I think that was a part of what they were trying to do. They were trying to talk about Jesus in a way that people related to, and to perhaps open up our own understanding of the Gospels, perhaps, not just people seeing, I have a lot of students who try to reshape what I'm saying and say, well, it's kind of like four people seeing an accident or four people knowing the same person. They might all interact with that person differently. And I think that's good. That's an important parallel, but it's, the scholar in me also wants to point out that these Gospels are also coming out of different moments in time in the development of the Christian movement or the Jesus movement, however you want to refer to that. So the Gospels themselves are also reflecting a little bit of a change, or like an evolution of thought, a change in belief about who Jesus was. So it isn't four snapshots of the same person. It's four snapshots of how their thoughts and beliefs are changing, actually, and growing and expanding. So, yes, they are. They do have an agenda. Were they inspired by God? Sure. That's a whole nother conversation, but I want to throw that into our conversation here, Callid, because, what does that mean? That all scriptures got breathed? That's a part of my book too, but just what does it mean that God inspired these writers? I think that's a very good question that's worth having a conversation. Perhaps I think of inspiration differently than you do, or than many of your listeners do. But I don't mean to say that people weren't inspired, because I have no idea. I wasn't there. I do think that what they wrote was relevant, and it meant something, and it connected with people, and that's why they were collected and kept and passed along.
So it's not necessarily that these men were purposefully manipulating the story for their own gains, but they could not help but articulate the story in their own way because that was their context. Is that the framing there?
I think so. And I think what's really interesting, there's a book out that helps you compare the three synoptic gospels and the gospel parallels by Throckmorton. But, when you look and see that Matthew and Luke both use a parable, but they have different endings to it, that's not malicious, but that is showing you that they both found this parable relevant to this overall story they're trying to tell, but that their takeaway on that parable was slightly different. And when you look at them in parallel like this, you can see that their takeaway is related to their overall essence that they're trying to paint of Jesus. So you can, again, kind of going back to the text itself and not trusting another scholar, you can see that for yourself, that the gospel writers were doing different things, even with the same story. And that's okay. And the challenge for a lot of people is to get to the place of letting that be okay, right?
One of the reasons I picked the Jesus chapter is because there was a piece of it kind of in one of your boxed off asides, which I had never actually come across. And I was astounded kind of by it, not because it was like earth-shattering, but it's a pretty significant thing to have never like thought about before. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the genealogies there, and the comparisons between the numbers of people and what does it mean that they go in one direction versus the other. Because I think that like that's a piece of scholarship that, you had to have access to even know to talk about that. And maybe that's an easy thing to come across. But the way you put it out there is to say, see, this is just one of a myriad examples where something which you've maybe read and or glazed over a number of times actually suggests that there's something going on here other than just kind of pure narration. Can you talk a little bit about the genealogies there? I thought that was fascinating.
Absolutely. And I can actually, spent an hour in a class just talking about the two genealogies in Matthew. I mean, it sounds silly, and yet that's how rich they are, right? So thank you. It's a great thing to discuss. So when we look at Matthew's genealogy, it is the very first thing that we get in Matthew's gospel. And it starts with Abraham, and it takes 14 generations to get to David, and then 14 generations to get to the exile, the destruction of the temple and the exile to Babylon. And then another 14 generations, actually 13, to get to Jesus. And so it's there's a very nice number symbolism going on there. We start with the father of the Jews, right? And we get to really significant moments in the Jewish story, the story of the Israelites, right? And then now we have Jesus. Well, so then you compare those numbers of generations to the people that are listed in Luke's genealogy. And Luke's genealogy comes in chapter 2 or 3 or 4. I can't remember which. It's not at the very beginning, and it's being used a little bit differently to tell a different part of Jesus' story. And the Luke's genealogy starts with Jesus and moves backwards. So it starts with Jesus and talks about being the son of the son of the son of, and if you compare to Matthew, when you get to Abraham, they have listed different names, and Luke has more listed than Abraham did. So just on that point, right, to your question, was Matthew being deceptive because he was leaving numbers out? Did Luke know about the author of Luke know about other people that Matthew didn't? Perhaps neither, perhaps both. Perhaps Matthew knew of the generations and he just was trying to point in a different direction. He's trying to say something here. He's not trying to be manipulative or deceitful. He's trying to massage the data in a way that points to his point that he's trying to make, which is there's something important about Jesus and his Jewishness here, right? That's what Matthew's doing. Luke is talking about Jesus as the savior of the world. And so Luke's thing is he connects Jesus not just to Abraham, but all the way back to Adam, who's the son of God. And so, the genealogy in Matthew is very Jewish sounding. The genealogy in Luke is the whole world. And so even their birth stories, their birth people, that story points to what each of these two gospel writers is trying to do.
How is it that the whole world versus the Jewish world genealogy matters for those two gospel writers?
Well, I think that Matthew's Jesus he's trying to show. See, you have to back up to Mark though, because Mark's Jesus is talking, in my opinion, and I'm not alone, but I think that Mark's Jesus is showing that Jesus was a son of God and you could perhaps say a Messiah, but not in the way that the Jews had been anticipating. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of sit with, and in particular for Christians to sit with and wrap their mind around because of the conversation. Why don't Jews see Jesus as a Messiah? How about flip that question around? Most of the Jews did not see Jesus as a Messiah. And why is that? And so you need to talk about the history. You need to talk about what a Messiah would have looked like in the first century. What were they expecting? They were expecting someone to come in and overthrow the occupier and allow them to have those three promises they've been holding on to for 1800 years, right? Allow those three promises to come to fruition. It was a very political, it was a very this world issue. And that is not what Jesus ended up being. And yet, in light of everything Paul says about Jesus, which he says before the Gospel of Mark is written, we have a new idea of a Messiah or a Son of God in Jesus. And so now we've got to write the story. And so Mark's Gospel talks about the story of Jesus and ends up talking about him as a Son of God. And it's a way that nobody from the Jewish tradition really would have expected. So that's shocking. And there are all these elements of Mark's Gospel that point to this. Wait, hold on to the end. This isn't what you think. Hold on. All these spirits he's casting out, spirits saying you're the Son of God, and Jesus tells them to be quiet. All kinds of scholarly conversation about that. Why would Mark's Jesus do that? Or why doesn't he say, yes, I am? He says, no, be quiet. Don't tell anyone, because I'm a Son of Man. I'm the Son of God you're not expecting. Wait for it to play out. So then you have Matthew coming along and saying, but, not generationally, but just thinking about the time that's passing, what Paul did in talking about Jesus as the Savior and as the Messiah, although the Christ, the Christos, oh gosh, I'm letting my guard down. That was, I think, I have told my Jewish family members and friends, I think that was a little bit offensive for other Jews. Paul changed things when he said, Gentiles get to be a part of the covenant through Jesus. And not all the Jews at that point in time were okay with that. And so Paul didn't create Christianity. Paul created a sect of Judaism that now embraced the Gentiles. And that took some time to kind of foment and build. And Paul was mostly in areas of, Greece and Asia Minor, so modern day Turkey, where the Gentiles were predominant. And that's what he was doing. And then you have these conversations between Paul and Peter and the real disciples of Jesus, and they're not agreeing on how this whole thing works. So what you have is a sect of Judaism in the first century that is embracing Jesus as the Christ. And that grows. This becomes a tension, because now you have sects of Judaism that do embrace Jesus, one that does embrace, and the rest that don't. And so I think we should look at Matthew's Gospel as being written to those sects within the family of Judaism that don't embrace Jesus as the Christ, as saying, this is why you should. Being written to other Jews and say, see, look, he's of the lineage of Abraham. He's connected to us as people. Look at all the stories in his life that I'm telling you that echo what happened in the prophets and what happened in the people of Israel for centuries. Look at how much his life lines up with his Jewish heritage and family and tradition and stories. And therefore, you can be on board with this idea of Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ. And then Luke's Gospel is doing something yet again a little bit different, a little bit later, but it is talking about how you can be okay with Jesus bringing the Gentiles into the covenant. Jesus is the Savior of the whole world, not just the Jewish Messiah, as was described by my buddy Matthew over here 10 years ago, right? So I think Luke's Gospel is very much in tune with the tradition of Paul and what Paul was doing in welcoming Gentiles into the covenant through Christ. And now you have a gospel that much more clearly lines up with that vision of what Paul was doing, however unsettling it might be for other members of the Jewish family at that point in time. And so Luke's depiction of Jesus is that he's here for everybody, not just the Jews. And you see that the very first 4 chapters are just rich. They are rich with this content, talking about the stories of Elizabeth and Mary talking, cousins that have children in the womb, and they end up being really important to each other as well. And you have all these, the Magnificat comes from the beginning of Luke, this beautiful talking about God saving the people and leveling the inequalities and injustices. I mean, that's what comes out in these songs at the beginning of Luke, these announcements that the Savior, he's coming and he's going to make all things right in this world. And then you have Jesus going into his hometown synagogue, reading a passage of Isaiah. It's such a powerful passage in Luke, reading a passage from Isaiah, sitting down, and it's the passage that talks about giving sight to the blind, and that whole beautiful passage. And he sits down, he says, That's coming to fruition here. You've seen this. This is essentially it's set up as if Jesus is saying, here are my talking points here's my platform for my movement is this segment. And the people in the synagogue, according to the story in Luke, were delighted to hear this because it was being said to them as Jews. And then Jesus turns around and says, oh, no, wait, you don't get it. This isn't just for you all. This is also for Gentiles. And that's when they try to throw him off the cliff. So the Gospel of Luke starts out by showing you all of this matter, all of these ideas and these issues, and showing you from the get-go that Jesus is not just connected to the Jews, but even his heritage, his genealogy shows he's connected to all humans, right? Not just Abraham, but all the way back to Adam and God himself, right? So I don't know if that clarifies a little bit.
No, and and I think that's indicative of kind of your general kind of MO, which is to say this thing, these lists, these genealogical lists, which most of us have. We read the first couple names and then we skip to the end. And maybe we've counted them up, and our pastor or somebody has told us why there's different numbers or something, but what's within these two little lists, which don't comprise narrative per se, right? There's no beginning, middle, end to a list of names in terms of time. They actually point at relationships between Jesus and communities, between the disciples and communities, between the disciples and each other, between the disciples and Paul, who's a little bit further east of everybody, and we can see that because of the work that's been done, kind of to understand history, to understand context, to understand communication technique, and they just show up. Evidences of these things are kind of like embedded in these two lists of names, and I'm really glad you went on that wide-ranging kind of discourse right there, because it does exactly the thing that you're saying is possible. Like if we dig into a piece of this book that we all hold as powerful, and we really dig into it, it's even thicker than we think it is.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So I have a question. So kind of pull out of the text in general and ask you a question. As someone who has spent an enormous amount of time thinking about the scholarship related to this book, and also, reading Bible over and over again, to go back to the beginning, because I'm curious to your thoughts here. You said at the beginning, I think that some folks are interested in reading the book in a literalistic way, but then you said, actually, it's more complicated than that. Why is it more complicated, and what is literalistic or literal? Like, tell me about that complication.
Yeah, I can actually point to a specific story that kind of unsettles this literalistic reading, right? So just to be clear, when I think of the way I read it literalistically, I took especially some of those commands and the things in some of the letters, especially that were talking to women, I took them very seriously. And I said, okay, woman is not to teach or have authority over man. A wife is supposed to be submissive to the husband, and we could discuss what that really means, if you want that to be equal or not. But that's how I thought about myself in relationships to men, whether they were, romantic or not, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I took those commands very seriously. And that's what I think many people are thinking of when they talk about reading the Bible literally. When you look at some of the parables, however, that many of us, and I don't know how many of your listeners will resonate with this or not, but there are some parables that many of us were taught to read metaphorically and not a little more literally. And therefore and I'll give you an example in a second, but just to explain. So if we read them literally, we would actually be doing the story and our history more justice. But because we're taught to read them spiritually or metaphorically, we're missing the meat of the parable, right? So there's one parable in particular that's very fun to talk about because of this. And it's the parable of the vineyard owner who, a man has a piece of land, and he builds a vineyard on it, and then he leaves. He hires some workers to work it, and he leaves and goes to far off country, right? And then the story kind of unfolds so that people, just to try to do this both at the same time, I was taught to think of this parable as set up as God as the vineyard owner, right? And the vineyard that he planted in this land was the covenant, and the workers that he hired were the Jews. So that's how I'm taught to read the story playing out, right? And so the story plays out that when, the fruit is coming, and it's time for the owner to get his share, he sends somebody to go get some, and the workers in the land say, "Oh, heck no," and we won't allow that. Beats them and send them back empty-handed, and this happens several times, right? I was taught to think of that as God sending his prophets with a message, and that the Jews rejected it time and time again, and that then the owner says, "Well, what am I going to do? I'll send my son. Surely they'll respect him." He sends his son, and in the story, the workers say to each other, "This is the son, the heir. If we kill him, we'll get the inheritance of the land." And so they kill him. And so then that parallel becomes that the Jews end up killing Christ, end up killing Jesus, right? And then in the story, Jesus says, so what is the landowner going to do? Depending on which version of it you read, Matthew or Luke, I like the one in Luke better personally, but, he says he's going to kill them all and hired new workers. Well, the parable itself is being told in the temple by Jesus to the masses, right? With the temple leaders standing nearby. So in the parable, in the story, Jesus says, this is what he's going to do. And all the people say, oh no, let it not be. All kinds of different translations. No. And then it follows up and says, the leaders knew that Jesus was speaking this parable against them. Well, what this parable has justified over the centuries is the harsh treatment of Jews by Christians. To say that this parable is about Jews rejecting the covenant, rejecting God, and that even the Jews killed Jesus, and God is going to come along and kill all of those workers, the Jews, and give the covenant, the vineyard, to a new group of people, the Christians. This has been significantly important in this supersessionism and in the idea of Christianity replacing Judaism, and all kinds of hatred and animosity has been justified based on that reading of this parable. However, if you actually read it literally, as opposed to spiritually or metaphorically, you would see that it's actually a parable that Jesus is telling as he's standing in the temple. And it's a parable in that it's a story. And one of the things that we know that was going on is that at the time, so during Jesus' lifetime, is that there was a change in the way that the Romans collected taxes from the Jews. The Romans made a change, and they forced the temple leaders to be the ones collecting the taxes. And I usually encourage people to take a moment to think that through. What if your pastor was the one who collected your federal taxes? What would that look like? How would that go over? And what typically ends up happening when you give people both power and control of money is they tend to exploit it or take advantage of the situation. And what we see happening is exactly that the temple leaders, so the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, all of these people that you see Jesus coming, kind of butting heads with throughout the Gospels. The reason he's butting heads with them is not because he's trying to create a new religion. He's trying to call his own leadership back to their commitment to the covenant. He's saying, the commitment to the covenant with God is to worship, to love God and only God, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And when over the centuries, the Jewish leaders have not done that, but have actually taken advantage of their own people to their own benefit, look at Amos, right? My favorite prophet to talk about. It's short, it's concise, and it's right to the point on this issue. That's what the prophets are saying, calling their leaders and their kings and whoever back to a covenantal relationship, with their own people. That's what Jesus is getting riled up about. That's what his thing in the temple is about. He's not saying, you're making too much money on selling animals for the sacrifices in the temple. He's saying the temple is where all the robbers collect their goods. The den of robbers is where robbers are safe and where they sit and count their loot. And so he is frustrated and irritated with the leadership in the temple. So he's telling this parable because what happens is those temple leaders are those landowners. The temple leaders get plots of land when people can no longer pay their taxes. If you have nothing left to pay, what do you pay your taxes with? Your property. And so that segment of land that landowner gets is because of the taxation, the overtaxation of the people. And so he's telling a real story about real events that took place, that one of the temple leaders has a piece of land and he's going to go, let's make this into a vineyard. And then I'm going to go back down to Jerusalem and I'm not going to have to get my hands dirty with what's going on here day in and day out. And I'm going to send somebody in my place to go collect my portion of the produce. Well, if the people that lived on the land before couldn't make enough money to pay the taxes and survive on, how are they now, as perhaps the workers of the land, going to live, pay taxes, and the portion of the produce that goes to the landowner? So now they're in a worse bind than they were before they had to give up the land to begin with, right? You tracking with me? Yeah. So this is a spiral of violence, the systemic issue of the overtaxation, the unfair taxation system. But it's not necessarily that Jesus is okay with those the workers on the land hurting and killing and punishing the people that the landowner sends to collect. It's not that he's saying that that's okay. He's saying they're caught in a bind. And when they get together and say, hey, if we kill the heir to this inheritance, we might get the land back. That's what they're saying. They're not saying they're being just super greedy and, no. So he's naming the frustration of this taxation system for people, the very real daily lived experiences. And so when Jesus says at the end, and what is the landowner going to do to these workers? He's going to kill them all and replace them. The people in the temple all have relatives that has happened to. They get it. They know it. And the leaders know that Jesus is talking about them and their unjust practices. And what are they supposed to, so if we read that story literally, right, more appropriately, we would be challenged. We would be challenged about the economic inequalities and injustices. And we wouldn't see it as supersessionism and justifying this tension and frustration.
I can imagine the headline now, progressive Bible scholar requests flock to read Bible literally. Right? I mean, to some degree, that's one of the things you're saying is like, no. What we say, what people mean when they say, no, I believe the Bible is the God-breathed kind of inspiration of God, and within it, I read all those texts literally. What that stands in for is the opposite of that, which is to say, no, except for the texts that I don't read literally, which mean this thing. And so this is an interesting move, which is to say, as someone who was probably more comfortable with people, or conservative folks might have more of an issue with some of the things you're saying than some progressive folks. Once again, you're kind of not quite there, because you're saying to some progressive folks, no, actually, if you read the Bible literally, you'll see some stuff there that in fact you haven't seen before, because you've treated the whole text as a big metaphor.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, I get these not glazed over, but just kind of frustrated looks from people. They're like, how do you know when you're doing which and when you're doing what? Well, one of the places you can start is to think about the group of people it was written for and by. And it was written for and by the migrant workers, not the elite, right? It was not written by those in power. It was written by and for those specifically not in power. And so you start there. And if you read these stories with people there, that helps, but there isn't a stamp of this is how you do it.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So here's my last question.
Okay.
So it's the case, and I happen to agree with you, that part of the reason that we have such kind of fractiousness in American kind of Christian landscape is that there are a significant number of people, some of us at earlier versions of ourselves, some people currently, who are interested in definitive answers. And there's a certain appeal to saying that those definitive answers, in fact, reside between the covers of this book. Now, you happen to think that not only does the Bible not give us completely definitive answers on everything. I think you probably would say there's some definitive stuff in there, but it's not the definitive answers for kind of living your life right before leaving Earth. I want you to think pastorally, whether or not you identify as a pastor, and say, well, how do we then have conversations with those folk who want those answers that are black and white when we don't think that book provides those answers? How do we have that conversation in a way that's helpful and fruitful?
I think that's a really great question. So I appreciate the prompt. And I would say, first of all, that, as a pastor, I'm pretty sure many pastors wrestle with this in terms of life is complex, right? I don't deny the desire for simple answers, right? I can identify with that. And yet I think that's not fair. I think it isn't fair to us as human beings. And I don't think it's fair to our collective communal experiences. And perhaps really what it is perhaps we would need to find a specific topic to talk about where you want definitive versus messy or complex. But that's where I would invite people to start is if you want definitive answers, okay. But guess what, people? That's not real life. And so I think that becomes a pastoral conversation about life in general and not just about the Bible specifically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so instead of abstracting kind of how things are or are not, you say, well, tell me a story about, and you actually start bringing personal narratives into it.
Right. And I think of, in particular, people really in particular when it comes to death, right? That's a place of life that we can all relate to, that we all have to deal with. And this is one of those areas that make me so uncomfortable and frustrated when people try to have pat comments or responses for people who've just lost someone, whether tragically or not, but especially when it's tragic, when it's completely unexpected, a car accident, something bizarre that you just didn't see coming. And people want to put some sort of explanation or answer or pat, this is why it happened on it. I don't think that's real. I don't think that's fair. I get why people want to say that, but we need to talk about life a bit more complexly than that. And I think a lot of us learn to expect or are, we want those answers because we're not getting from our spiritual leaders a more complex way of talking about it our whole lives. So we get to be adults and we've just been given bits and pieces and specific answers versus complex conversations. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think then the Bible then becomes a part of a complex conversation and the Bible itself is talking to itself, right? The passages are talking to each other at times about this isn't quite all there is to say on this conversation. So I interrupted you there.
No, and I think that, part of what I hear you naming here is something that you name throughout the book, which is not only is the Bible in conversation with itself, but if you really want to engage the Bible in a way that's richer, then you're going to let yourself be invited to that conversation instead of treating it like it's a kind of monolithic object.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Folks, the book is Permission Granted. Take the Bible into your own hands. The author is Jennifer Grace Bird, and it's from Westminster John Knox. I really encourage you to get a hold of it. The link is up on homebrewedchristianity.com. It has been an absolute pleasure, Jennifer. Thanks for being on the show.
Likewise. Thank you, Callid.